Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to sit because my foot's broken, if anyone doesn't know. It's on the mend, but it's still broken, so I'm supposed to stay off it if I can. If you can't see me, I'm sorry. Hey, Heather. All right. We are in Found in Translation, a class about expanding our understanding of biblical words. And we have looked at 4 tools for what I've called expanding our biblical encyclopedias. I'm not going to go over these again today. If you've been with us for a while, you've seen them a bunch of times. And it's not really what we're doing today, but I wanted to show them again. Last week, we took a bit of a different direction, and we started talking about what I'm calling cleaning our biblical encyclopedias. And I've got cleaning in quotes there because I tried to think of a better word and I couldn't. I don't really love cleaning because it implies that something is dirty and needs like fixing, and that's not what I'm trying to imply with this. So your encyclopedia for English is probably awesome, and there's nothing wrong with it, but when you take it to something that is not modern English, it's going to have all sorts of associations and preferences and things that just don't fit with what you're trying to bring it to. So when you go into any kind of cross-cultural situation, you talk to somebody who's not a native English speaker, you travel abroad, you read something that was written 100 years ago, you start going, what are they talking about, right? And that's because your encyclopedia is not broad enough yet to take everything in. That's what we've been doing for the most of the class. But also it's because your encyclopedia is preloaded to interpret things in certain ways that the person who wrote or the person who you're talking to, their encyclopedia is not preloaded to create in that way. So there's cross-communication too. Last week we looked at trying to avoid bringing cultural ideas to the text. Hi, good morning. Come on in. And specifically, we thought about, as an example, we looked at Matthew 5:5, where Jesus says the meek will inherit the earth. And I talked about how my encyclopedia, when I hear the word earth, immediately goes to planet. And planet was almost certainly not in the mind of any person who heard Jesus say, the meek shall inherit the earth in Aramaic. Or anyone who read the Gospel according to Matthew when it was first written in Greek. Because some people were aware that the earth was round at that point in history, but the average person almost certainly had no idea and didn't care. Right? So that kind of thing, you can end up actually missing some of the stuff that the original authors or the original speakers intended by bringing something to the text that is not native to it. That's what we looked at last week. This week we're going to look at what I'm going to call connotative drift. As far as I'm aware, there's not an official term for this, so I'm making one up. Connotation stands opposed to denotation. If you go look up a word in the dictionary, what you find is the denotation, what the word means. Connotation is the association you have with that word. So I could say, there's a stench in this room. Or I could say, there's an aroma in this room. And both words mean there's a smell. But you have different connotations with each of those, right? One's bad, one's good. So what happens is, over time, even if the definition of a word doesn't actually change, your associations around it can change, and that will lead you to think about things in a totally different way. So let me give you a couple examples to make this a little more concrete. Somebody who is over 30 and does not work with children, do I have anyone in this room that fits that bill? Okay, can you tell me what the word bet means? Bet? What does the word bet mean?
You want to put money out on something.
Okay, yeah. You're going to put money on something and you're going to hope to win. Somebody who has children or works with children or is in high school or college, one of y'all, can you tell me what, if you hear a 14-year-old say bet, what do they mean?
They're saying
I'm down. Let's do it. I'm in. Right? Yeah. So, you all didn't know this? No. Okay. Now, I suspect that what happened is the phrase "you bet," they dropped the "you" and it just became "bet." Yeah. And it just means I'm in. Right? So, this word has shifted over time. Another one that has happened that you all are probably familiar with is the word man. 100 years ago, or even as little as 50 years ago, maybe, you could say man about humanity, and you were not necessarily referring to a male human being. In English, you were referring to a collective whole, and people understood this. Our sensitivities about that have changed. And now if you say man, people are going to assume you specifically mean male human being, and they might even be offended at you if you try to use it in the old sense to mean humans in general, right? It changes over time. We've looked at this before, all right? Words do not exist in isolation. They exist within the context of a language. And what you're saying around the word is sometimes more important than the word itself. Languages don't exist in isolation. They exist within the context of a culture. If you go to another culture that speaks the same language, same word is going to mean something different. Ask someone in England what the back part of their car is. Right? It's not the trunk, it's the boot. Right? Same word, same language, different culture, means something different. And last week we started looking at how culture doesn't exist in isolation either, but it exists within the context of a time and place. If you wait long enough or you travel far enough, the same word is going to mean something different. So, let's see this in practice with the Bible. Several weeks ago now, we looked at this passage from John 1 and verse 14. We looked at several translations of it, and then we looked at the actual Greek. We were focusing on the word that gets translated as dwelt or lived or made his home, moved into the neighborhood. Yeah, come on in. Hi. You're fine. And we saw how what we were looking at then is how you using different translations can show you where you need to dig deeper. And when you see a wide spread like this, it's a hint that, hey, something's going on in the original language that's difficult to translate. Go to the source and figure it out. And then we went to the source and saw that eskenosin is actually a word that means to live in a tent, which has some implications backwards to Jewish culture and Jewish history with the tabernacle. But today what I want to look at is, if I'm using this translation, and I'm looking at the word dwell, when this was translated originally, and I don't have the date off the top of my head when the ESV was translated, but my assumption is this was a great translation. For me, it is not a very good translation, and I'll tell you why. Your encyclopedia may be totally different than mine. In fact, I'm sure that it is, because that's how everyone's encyclopedia works. They're all individual. But for me, when I see this word dwell, this is what happens. I feel that it's very archaic, impersonal, maybe even inhuman. I would never ever say, I dwell at 8600 Trevada Drive. That's just not a phrase I would ever use. I don't think of anybody, unless I'm in a church building, I'm probably not going to use the word at all. And if I do use it, I'm going to talk about maybe God, right? God dwells in heaven. I'm not going to talk about, Katie and Justin, they dwell over there. And if I do use it outside of the church, I might use it to talk about what's going on in my head. I've been dwelling on this idea, right? And so for this reason, for me, the connotation around the word dwell, even though literally it means live, is this very abstract, very thought-based, spiritual, out there kind of word that does not convey the immensely personal and intimate thing that John is trying to say about what Jesus did in John 1. When John says God dwelt among us, he means he was one of us. He came here. You could point to him. You could have a meal with him. You could shake his hand. You could talk to him. Right? For me, dwell doesn't communicate that. It keeps it in this sort of weird abstract realm of like, what are we even really talking about? It's something nebulous. So when I use the word dwell, I risk missing what John is actually saying. Again, this may not be true for you. Your encyclopedia is different than mine. But I think it's important to be aware of what your encyclopedia is doing and try to watch out for that connotative drift. So let's practice this together. We're going to look at a passage. This is from John 1, 47 to 51. This is the first time that Jesus meets Nathanael. One of the other disciples has met with Nathanael and told him, you got to check out this Jesus guy. Come with me. We're going to meet him. All right. Daniel, would you mind to read it for us? Thank you.
Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, How do you know me? Jesus answered him, Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered him, Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man.
Thank you. So, this is a familiar passage. Yes, we've all read this before, I assume, right? I want to highlight some things in here that, again, for me, may not be true for you, can actually distance me from what's happening in this scene. So there's a lot. Behold, indeed, whom? Deceit. Rabbi, because I told you this, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. Truly, truly, you will see heaven opened and ascending and descending. I'm going to pull these words out because, for me, these sound really academic and old-timey and not how I would word it. I mean, are you all with me on this? Okay? I've never used the word behold in conversation in my entire life. So what happens here is, if you're not paying attention and not thinking about this, people don't talk like this in English. And so you can come away with this this impression that Jesus and the people that he interacted with were these like highfalutin academic types who used this kind of language and spoke very formally and in weird turns of phrase that are not how we would order it. Which is just not the case. Aside from maybe a couple of his disciples or a few of his interactions, Matthew perhaps, whenever Jesus talks with Pharisees who are highly educated in their culture, right? Most of them, they're just regular working class guys, right? Many of them were fishermen. Jesus himself was a carpenter by trade. One of the things that the Bible repeatedly says people were shocked about with Jesus is that he sounded like he knew what he was talking about. He goes back to his hometown of Nazareth, and they go, "Isn't this Joseph's kid? Where did he learn to talk like this?" And so Jesus has great understanding, but the way that he's talking about things and the way that his disciples are talking about things is just ordinary, everyday way of talking. I say here, these people, they were ordinary folks. They may have been talking about extraordinary things, but they were talking about them in ordinary ways. So here's my thoughts on this, and then I'd like to hear from you all. I have often imported a sense of archaic formality into what is ordinary talk in the Bible. The Bible is written in what's called Koine Greek. It's the kind of Greek that if I were a Greek teacher in the ancient world, I would probably take points off if you wrote an essay to me in Koine Greek. Be like, this is not how you do academia, right? When I graded a paper yesterday where the student used the word finna. He's finna do something, right? Totally fine in everyday conversation, not okay in an academic paper, right? But the Bible is written in everyday common speech. I don't know of an example of somebody using an equivalent of. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? That's a young person. Okay. I didn't think about it. What?
There's somebody here who does.
Yeah, so it's short for fixing to, as in going, like I'm going to do something. I'm finna help out or whatever. Right? So, but that's how the Bible is written. It's written in just like everyday language. And it's been translated, especially if you're reading a translation from decades ago, centuries ago even. You're going to look at it and it's going to feel very formal, very high language, very academic, which is not how, at least the Greek New Testament, most of it was written. Now, there are places where it is formal academic language. Paul giving his address at Mars Hill, for example, he ups his professionalism when he's there. He's talking to a group of philosophers and religious scholars, right? You go to the Old Testament, you're going to find all kinds of examples of common everyday speech, but also court ledgers in a king's government, right? Those are going to be different levels of talking. But if you come thinking it's all at that high level, you can come away with some really weird impressions. All right, my last thought here. I can get a sense that Jesus and his followers were always serious, they were highly educated, and that they're difficult to understand. That has been my experience, and maybe it hasn't been for you. I don't think that that's true. And I don't think that the original hearers or the original readers would have thought this. Now, maybe difficult to understand in some ways. There are times when Jesus intentionally obscures what he's talking about because he doesn't want to die yet. And he knows that if he's completely clear about his message, he's going to upset the wrong people, and they're going to set things in motion that he knows are going to be in motion eventually, but he's trying to reach as many people as he can first. But for the most part, and especially when we get glimpses into the inner circle, like when the disciples come to him and they say, hey, can you explain that parable to us? This you shouldn't be seeing. You shouldn't be thinking of it as difficult to understand. Does anybody in here watch the show The Chosen? I'm assuming a lot of you do. I have some issues with the show The Chosen, but for the most part, I think it's very good, and what they're doing is awesome. And I think they're combating this really well by giving us a glimpse at what it may have looked like for people just going about living their everyday lives, talking normally, cracking jokes, getting upset with each other, in the context of the Gospels. If you're not familiar with the show, it's a dramatization of the Gospels, of Jesus and his interaction with people. And I think they do a really good job of making it feel grounded and just like normal conversation. Questions about this idea of connotative drift
would you characterize quantitative drift as far as transliteration? Just
far as-
like a lot of our texts have come through 14th, 15th century English,
Right.
and then been understood through that lens.
Right. So yeah, a lot of the things that you may have memorized are probably are likely from that sort of 14th, 15th century. For example, I know the Lord's Prayer. I know the King James version of it. That's what I memorized. There's a lot of stuff in there like hallowed. Unless I do some research, I got no clue what I'm saying. Right? Right now, if you're familiar with the Bible Project, they're taking their podcast series all year for 2024. They're going through the Sermon on the Mount, and they've Dr. Tim Mackey, who's a Hebrew scholar and an Old Testament scholar, has translated the Lord's Prayer in kind of a new way, and it was revelatory for me to kind of look at it through that new lens and go, oh, I've had so for hallowed, for example, they translate that as may your name be recognized as holy. And even that, I would have gone maybe even a little bit further, because holy is a very churchy word. And it's the right word, but is there, I wonder, is there a way we could have made that even more kind of informal, personal to help us understand? I don't know. So your question is?
Well, just how the interplay is between drifting
Mhm.
language
Yep.
versus transliteration, where you're getting a lot of influence. Like when you've got King James Version coming from Byzantine text, which
Right.
is only from the 900s.
Right.
You've got a lot of language that was chosen there based on their current 14th and 15th century English.
Right.
And then that has influenced translators moving forward.
Right.
So they set a pattern that even when you have translators going back to older versions of text,
Yes.
Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, going back to 2nd century, like as much close to the autographs as we can get.
Mhm. Even then, they sometimes lean on the what came before. Yeah, exactly.
Because
So
they've been saturated in that King James version, that language
Right.
from the 14th, 15th century.
right. So anyone who's not familiar with what he's talking about, so there have been new translations since the King James version, and some as recently as like this year, I'm sure. And even if those translations are going back to older, more original texts than what the King James was translating, because they're coming after things like King James and the New International Version and New Revised Standard and all of those, there's kind of conventions and expectations for what a certain passage sounds like, or if there's, maybe a couple ways you could translate this. Well, everyone's done it this way, so we're going to do it that way as well, is what tends to happen. And so, if I'm understanding you, like, what do you do about that? Is the
Well,
question,
I
or?
mean, there are two separate things that are happening, but they're causing some of the same issue.
Sure.
So how do you differentiate between them?
I see.
Are you trying to make a differentiation, or are you just talking about this particular thing?
Today, I'm talking about this particular thing. If you want to make sure you're not, or you're getting the full picture, you can go back to some of the earlier tools that we've used. Particularly, Logos is a huge help here. If you use Logos Bible software, you can look at those original texts and skip the middleman and say, okay, what does this word mean? How are all the possible ways it could be used? And then decide for yourself what you think it means in this particular context of the verse in the chapter that you're looking at. And not just lean on the trust that your translators have done a good job. Now, again, I think our translators have done a great job. I'm not trying to say that they're bad or the Bible that you've grown up with is wrong. I don't think that. But I think that there's deeper understanding to be found if you do some digging. Daniel?
Yeah, Derek, don't you think you can find a range, a small set of translations that have a different approach to the translation, and as you're reading, if you can just scan those 3, 4, whatever your set of comfort level is,
Yeah.
you can see what kind of differentiation there is in the language pretty quickly as you're looking through those.
Yeah.
And where there is that that variance that you were talking about earlier, when you see that, then that's when I would go back to Logos or
Yes.
I use Bible study tools or whichever it is.
Yeah.
Go back to one of those, and then you can really dig into that. But it would be hard to study from those all the time.
Yes. So you haven't been here for a lot of the class, but we've spent a lot of time on making sure that we are reading more than one translation and trying to get a spread from there's kind of a spectrum of different kinds of translations, from formal equivalents or word for word equivalents all the way to paraphrasing. And I advise that you read from, find one you like from across that spectrum, but read them all, and then you will see, okay, there's something weird is going on in this particular passage. Now let me dig deeper into it and use a scholarly tool and see if there's something there. But even before you get to this step, what I'm talking about today is sometimes when you just open up a Bible and you just read it, there might be some things in there that have shifted since it was translated that you should try to be aware of as you read. Jay?
How do you overcome this when it goes the other way? So like these words mean something slightly different to different people, and they're drifting in their time as well.
Oh, connotative drift in the original text.
Yeah, so you mentioned Matthew and how Bible Project has kind of been going through the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
This is several years ago. I was listening to Tim Mackey go through the whole book of Matthew.
Okay.
And one of the early podcast episodes was like how it's really helpful to actually read it in Hebrew or Aramaic because Jesus tends to do some really interesting and unique wordplay that you don't actually get in the Greek.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like, even though it's originally written in Greek, there's a connotative drift even within
you're already
text.
Even if you read the New Testament in Greek, you're reading a translation, because at least in the Gospels, because Jesus didn't speak Greek, he spoke Aramaic. And so everything that he said, his parables, his Sermon on the Mount, was originally given in Aramaic, and now you're reading it in Greek. So yes, you do sometimes miss some stuff. Now that's going to be here, and that's beyond where I'm at. I'm not even aware of a tool that allows you to read the Gospels in Aramaic. I'm sure one exists, but also I don't read Hebrew or Aramaic, so I would need some serious help to get to that point. But I think that would be a really cool experiment, and I think you would probably find a lot if you did it.
The Gospel of Matthew in particular is very fruitful for that.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go for it.
So, along with the Gospel of Matthew versus Luke versus Mark versus John, they all have a particular reader in mind as well. The Gospel of Matthew is almost certainly written for Jewish readers.
Yeah, it's very...
The Gospel of Luke written for Roman readers. And so, how do you, as you're studying, account for the intentionality of the author? You're talking about how in John today, it sounds like highly educated Greek, and that was perhaps the intent of John, was to hit the highly educated Greek.
I think in some ways it certainly was, yes. You read John 1, and you know much about Greek culture, you're going to recognize John knew some philosophy, and he knew what he was talking about. My point with the story is that when you're reading about a conversation between two blue-collar Jewish guys, they're probably not talking to each other in a way that, Greek senators would, or Roman senators would have been talking to each other. Yeah.
Well, and the authors are limited by their knowledge of the language.
Yes.
So John, having further Greek understanding, would write at a higher level
Yes.
than the rest of the authors for the different books.
That's true.
Same thing when you talk about the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Canonical writers and Kings, Chronicles, they're going to write write differently than
Right.
Spirit.
Right. For sure.
John was writing later, right? So he had, yeah, so he had the advantage
Probably.
of perspective and age and maturity. And
Yeah.
He would say things differently than a 30 or 40-year-old guy would.
Yes, that's true too. Very true. So, these are all of our tools for the class. These 4 for expanding our biblical encyclopedias, and these 2 for cleaning our biblical encyclopedias. Next week, I have a passage in mind that I'd like to use to kind of put all this together. But also, last week I mentioned that soon I'm going to be opening the floor to passages or sections that you all are interested in or confused about, and we're going to see if we can use these tools to help elucidate those in any way. So if you all come next week and you say, hey, I want to look at this, I want to look at this, great, we'll do that. If you all come and you don't have something for us, I have a plan in place for that as well. I'm curious, did anyone come today with a passage they're already thinking about? Joy?
Because the days are evil. And I can't remember where it is. I looked it up and I thought, how can days be
Yeah.
evil?
I don't know the reference.
Plagued me.
Yeah, where is that? Ephesians 5:16. Let's go.
Because it's because, so there's something we're supposed to do because the days are evil.
All right. Let's see if the internet will play nice today. Ephesians 5:16. So for anyone who has not been here and doesn't know what I'm doing right now, this is Logos Bible Software. An extremely helpful tool. And somebody was saying wouldn't be really feasible to use stuff like this all the time. Was that you? Yeah. And I agree. I don't suggest that you all use this constantly. I'm at a place in my personal study where I don't want to have a Bible open and not have this open. I realize that is niche, and not everybody thinks linguistically or has the background that I do. So I'm not suggesting that you all should do that. But I am suggesting that when you find that discrepancy among translations or something like that, go look. This is free. You can do it yourself. So, let's see here. 5:16. Well, let's start in 15 because this is the middle of a sentence. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Let's take a look at this word. Does anyone, I have not prepared for this, is anyone aware of the context here in Ephesians 5?
Just coming out of 4, it's live as children of light, right? That's the
Okay.
context.
Live as children of light. So this is maybe direction on how to live as children of light. So this word, poneros, it's the word evil. The days are evil. We're out of time, Joy. I'm going to look at this week, and hopefully I'll have some kind of answer for you next week.
Nice.
You won't be here? Okay. I'm also going to be gone a couple of weeks during July, so we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We may cancel class or something. I'm not sure yet. So, thank you all for coming today.